Om Asato Ma Sadagamaya Tamaso Maham Jyotirgamaya Mrityormam Amritam Gamaya Avir Maherhi Rudra Yate Dakshinam Mukha Te Namaham Pahinityam. Om. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality, and reach us through and through ourselves, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. My subject this morning is the story of creation. And we're going to be talking about involution and evolution. And this morning I am going to give you a religious world view. I'm not going to give you a materialist worldview. In the beginning was the self, in the form of a cosmic man. He lay floating on an ocean of infinite consciousness. His eyes were closed, but he was not asleep. He was absorbed in the bliss of samadhi. And from the very center of his being, there came forth a lotus. And the lotus petals opened and floated on that infinite ocean of consciousness. And in the middle there sat the great four-faced Brahma, who is the creator of this world. And Brahma looked to the north, and he looked to the south and the east and the west, and he couldn't see anything. And he realized that he was alone, and he felt afraid. And that's why sometimes when we're alone, we feel afraid. But then he thought, there is no one other than myself. I alone exist. What is there to fear? And he became fearless. And he closed his eyes and he began to meditate on the Vedas, the infinite storehouse of the sum total of all knowledge, the sum total of all the true propositions in the universe, the divine knowledge of God that existed incorruptible before time, space, and causation. All this knowledge existed before Brahma arose. He began to meditate on this knowledge. And he came to understand what he had to do. And he thought to himself, I will create worlds. And so how did he do? What did he do? Well, he listened very carefully. And he heard subtle particles of sound. He called them Shabda Tanmatra, the essence of sound. And now he knew the first of the 5 subtle elements. And he held up his hand. And he felt on his hand some particles of touch. And he called them Sparsha Tanmatra, the essence of touch. And he knew the second of the 5 elements. And he looked very carefully and he discerned some subtle shape and color. And he called it Rupa Tanmatra, the essence of form. And he had the 3 subtle elements. And then he tasted the prasad, the offerings, and he felt those taste particles, and he called them rasa tanmatra, the essence of taste. And then he smelled the fragrance of the incense that had been offered to God. And he called it Gandha Tanmatra, that is the essence of fragrance. And so he knew the 5 subtle elements and he entered into them. But to create this world, we need more than the 5 subtle elements. We need something more substantial. And so Brahma entered into meditation. And there he sees there in the Vedic words, Akashat Vayu, Vayuragni, Agnirapaha, Apa Prithivi, Prithivya Oshadaya, Oshadibhyo Nam, Annat Purushaha. List. That's the list of what he's going to do next. He knows because he has meditated on the Vedic truths. And so he takes the sound. He takes a particle of sound, and from that sound, he pulls out space. And the space, how did he get space? Well, you can't have sound unless you have 2 things which touch together. 2 things have to clap together. You can't clap your hands together unless there's space between them. So he presupposes space. So he created Akasha, space, the first of the 5 elements. And then he took that space and he added to that space some touch particles. And out of that he pulled air. And we know that air is the second of the gross elements because we can feel it. And it moves through space. But it doesn't have any other qualities. And then he took the air and he added some form particles. And out of that he pulled fire. And yeah, it makes sense because fire has some shifting forms and colors. We can feel it. We can see it. And from that fire, he added to that fire, he added some taste particles. And from that, he pulled out water. And water, well, tastes like water. So we know it, and we can feel it. And it takes many different forms and shapes. And so he had the four gross elements. And he took the water and he added smell particles to that water. And he pulled out earth. Because earth is a pancha tanmatric substance that has all those 5 qualities in it. And now he had the substance to create the gross world. He had the 5 elements and he entered into them. And then he meditated on the Vedas. And as he meditated on the Vedas, he learned that there are worlds above and there are worlds below. And so he created the solar sphere, that is, this gross sphere of physical space with the suns and the moons and the stars, and with its gross, tangible, physical matter and material force and energy. And then he created the lunar sphere, that is the sphere of the gods, in which there is no gross material matter. There are only thought forms, moved by psychic forces. And then he created the electric sphere, in which there's really no distinction. I can't hardly distinguish between matter and energy. Like in lightning, electricity, they both seem to be the same. And then he created the Brahmaloka, the highest sphere, which is beyond matter and energy, the world of mind and consciousness. And in this way, he created the worlds, and he entered into them. And then he meditated on the Vedas. And in the Vedas, he is called Prajapati, the father of living things. And so he created in those worlds, he created living things. He created plants. He created animals and fish and birds and mammals and mankind. And he entered into them. And so in this way, the cosmic man created this world, entered into it, and became everything that is, from Brahma down to a blade of grass. So that's the story of creation from the Upanishads. I've embellished on it a little bit. But let's just now contemplate some things that we can learn from the narrative. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The word God In Vedanta, God exists in two modes. There is an impersonal God, and there is a personal God. The impersonal God is called Ishwara. Ishwara is not his name. It just means that the all-powerful ruler of all everything. It's kind of a title. Ishwara is pure existence, consciousness, and bliss. Ishwara is the Godhead. And he just abides in infinite consciousness. He doesn't do anything. He's immovable. He's infinite. There's only God exists. There's nowhere for him to move. And so he couldn't possibly create the universe. In order to create, he needs a demiurge. He needs a personal God. And so there appears the great Lord Brahma, who is a personal God. He has a name, and he has a form. And we can contemplate his form. And Brahma is be considered an aspect of Ishwara. He's a manifestation of Ishwara. He's a function of the impersonal. His function is to create the world. Brahma originally, in mythology, we read the story, he was a man, like you and I. But he did great austerities for thousands of years, and life after life. And gradually, in the course of many lives, he rose in status among the spiritual aspirants to be the greatest of all the spiritual aspirants in the universe. And so, he became, that is, he was given this high job, that is, to create the universe. And that's his function. Now, when we say in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, when we say beginning, when we're beginning, those of us raised in a Judeo-Christian tradition, when we think beginning, of course, we're thinking in linear time. We're thinking that there's a line, and that the line starts somewhere, and it ends somewhere at the alpha and the omega. And if we can just progress far enough, that we'll get to the end of time. But in Indian philosophy, there is no linear time. There's only circular time, cyclic time. And therefore, when we say God created the world, we're referring not to an absolute beginning, but we're referring to the beginning of a cycle. Brahma is a person like ourselves, in that he is awake during the day, and he sleeps at night. And when he wakes up in the morning and during the day, the universe is manifested. And when he falls asleep at night, this whole universe dissolves and disappears and becomes unmanifest. But there's a time dilation effect. I say he's the same. He's a person. He's the same in that he is a person, but he's a meta-person. And one day of Brahma is equal to 7,000 yugas, millions and millions of years on the earth. And Brahma lives for 100 years. That's his allotted lifespan. And every day, all of the worlds are manifest. And at night, the worlds become unmanifested. That is, the three of the lower spheres of worlds become unmanifested. The worlds in the higher spheres remain. But at the end of his life, all the worlds are dissolved and become unmanifested and enter into the avyakta, prakriti, the unmanifested form. And the universe, we could call it, it's called the universe, that is, there's one cycle, is over. And Brahma is liberated. And a new Brahma will arise to take his place. So we say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Let's look at the word created. When we think of created, we naturally think of something made anew. And in the context of the creation of the world, creation out of nothing. Now, that idea of creation out of nothing is, of course, logically absurd. You can't have everything come out of nothing. And so in Indian philosophy, there is no creation in that sense at all. The word that's translated as creation, as it were, is shrishti. And shrishti literally means breathing out. We could translate it as Swami Vedarupananda translates it as projection. And so the technical term here for creation is the projection of the world. Nothing new is being created. It's only that which was potential is becoming actual. That which was unmanifested is becoming manifested. And the analogy given in the Upanishads is that of the spider who spins her web. And we can visualize that beautiful reticulated pattern which she has created, drawn forth just from her own being. And then she scampers around that net like a housekeeper, keeping it clean. And maybe in the end withdraws it all again into herself. And so similarly, God has projected this world, has not created it out of nothing. Now we could imagine that Brahma is like a farmer. Brahma is like a farmer who presides over and manages a field. This universe is like a field. There's the field and there's the knower of the field. And in the field, there are seeds that are planted. And the sun shines, and the wind blows and the rains fall and the seeds sprout. And the farmer there really doesn't have to do anything. He just presides over the field. He's the knower of the field. Just as the boss in the office doesn't really have to do anything. He has to be there, though. And everything works out in his presence. And so we could say that Brahma, in such a way, he creates the world. Swami Vivekananda says, Brahma first manifests as name and then as form. Everything in this world is name and form. That is, it is an idea, and it is a form. And that's how things become manifest. And we can imagine that a man the husband gets a shopping list from his wife. And on the shopping list, she sends him to the market, and he is to buy one carton of milk and a dozen eggs and a loaf of bread. That's what's on his list. And so he goes to the market, and he goes up and down the aisles with his basket, and he puts those items in his basket. And then he comes back, and he checks out, and he looks in the basket. That basket was empty before. And now there are things manifested in it. That is, in the course of his shopping, he's changed the world to the mind direction of fit. He's manifested those things. And all the other things in the market, when he leaves, all the other things in the market remain unmanifest. Similarly, it is in this world. That which is potential, we can see, hear, feel, and touch. But that which is unmanifested remains in a potential form. And, I hope to speak in much more detail on that subject in our lecture entitled Creation from the Word. Now, at this point, let's look at what we've been talking about. The ideas that we've been talking about are all derived from an ancient philosophy called the Sankhya. Now, if you're a student of the Vedanta philosophy, you'll read in the complete works of Swami Vivekananda. You'll read 2 major lectures and many class notes and talks on the subject of the Sankhya philosophy. It is good for us to expand our consciousness a little bit and to include that it so happens that that's the first philosophy in the world. It's the most ancient philosophy in the world, and Kapila, that is the architect of the Sankhya cosmology, is the father of all philosophy. And it's of interest to us as Vedantins because it is incorporated and assimilated into the Vedanta philosophy. And all the teachings are absorbed and incorporated into the teachings of the Vedanta philosophy. It's very helpful for us to study Sankhya, especially as Westerners, because it's all based on reason. There's no reference to any Sanskrit texts. You don't have to know anything about the Upanishads. You don't have to believe in the Vedas. You don't have to believe in any Bible or scriptures. It's all a logical analysis of the way things are. 3 things that we can learn from the Sankhya, apropos to our subject this morning. First thing we can notice is that we've been talking here about Brahma as a person and as a meta-person. That is, this Sankhya cosmology gives us an outline of involution, that is pre-evolution, we could call it. We could call it primary evolution. Let's call it involution. That's a better word, involution. Both from a macrocosmic and a microcosmic point of view. We can interpret it either way. So far, I've been interpreting it in a macrocosmic narrative of a cosmic creator. But we could also interpret it as applicable to an individual person, an individual self. Second thing we can notice about this Sankhya cosmology, how it goes. Notice how it goes. It goes from there's pure consciousness. There is primal nature. That's nature with a capital N. And then it's like a hierarchy. It's a cascades downward. Then comes intelligence. First comes nature. First comes consciousness. Then is nature. Then comes intelligence. Then is subtle elements and mind. And then is matter. And you may say, well, that's a strange list of all these different things. Well, that's the interesting thing. They're not all different. They're all the same. They're all part of the same cosmic stuff. That is the Prakriti. In Sankhya philosophy, there is pure consciousness, that is the Purusha, and there is Prakriti. In Prakriti, all intelligence and matter and mind are all the same thing. That is, they are from causal to subtle to gross. It's all different levels of vibration, different levels of gradual grossification. And so there is in Vedanta philosophy, there is no, as in Western philosophy, major problems like the mind-body problem. How does an immaterial mind communicate with a material world or arise from matter? All these questions are non-existent in Indian philosophy because mind and matter are made of the same stuff. That is nature. It's called in Sankhya, it's called Prakriti. And we can see too, the third thing we can learn from this Prakriti, from this Sankhya, we can see how it begins. This is a religious cosmology. It's a top-down causation. It begins at the top. It doesn't begin at the bottom. It begins with pure intelligence. And that pure intelligence then gives rise to the sense of I consciousness and subtle matter and subtle energies. And only then at the very end does gross, what we call gross material things appear. And so it doesn't begin at the bottom, it begins at the top. And there's a whole that's the hierarchy of involution. Now we get a very good image of this process in the 15th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which some people call the Bible of Hinduism. Okay, the Bhagavad Gita, 15th chapter, Urdhvamulam Shakam Ashwattham Prahuravyayam. The whole chapter, that's the first line, the whole chapter is chanted on every possible occasion by monks of the Ramakrishna order. It's a famous chapter. We're only referring to the first verse, the first line there which I quoted, which says, there is an eternal Ashwatha tree. Now we're giving us an image of involution. There is an eternal Ashwatha tree. Ashwatha tree, you know. Ashwatha tree is like if you read in Indian philosophy, you know about the banyan tree. The banyan tree, as it grows, the limbs grow out, and the roots come down from the limbs to form new trunks, and it can grow on and form like a whole forest of trees, from a single tree. In any case, the banyan tree is a form of fig tree. And the fig tree, that is this genus, figures seemingly in so many stories. Why scholars say that in the Garden of Eden, there wasn't an apple tree. Rather, it was probably a fig tree. And the Bodhi tree that we know, under which Buddha achieved his enlightenment, is a variety of fig tree. It's called Ficus religiosa. So that's the Ashwatha tree. But in the verse there it says, there is an eternal Ashwatha tree with its roots above and its branches below. And you can visualize a tree growing from the sky, coming down, and its leaves and its branches and leaves are just almost touching the earth. And there we contemplate that tree. What a strange tree it is. And, it's a peculiarity of visual optics that when light comes into the lens of the eye is curved. And when an image enters, the light enters into the eye and falls on the retina, it produces an inverted image of the object. Now, we don't see that inverted image. Why? Because we don't see the sense data. We see the object. But, so let's think about that. If we could, in our mind, we could turn that tree right side up, then we could see, immediately we're going to recognize, oh yes, we recognize that tree. That tree is the famous tree of life. That's the tree that appears in cultures all over the world, in all the religions and all the different domains of knowledge. Use that tree as a graphic organizer for growth and evolution. And now we're using the word evolution, because that tree kind of symbolizes, the tree of life, symbolizes evolution. In whatever domain you want to consider it, most of us are probably familiar with that image from our high school biology books and the diagram of the phylogenetic tree. And there, we're talking there about evolution and how evolution, they're talking now about evolution of the biosphere and how it begins with very primitive form, the forms of life, that is kingdoms, phylums, and order. And as it grows, it's growing up now, it's beginning to proliferate the ramifications of the branches into order, family, genus, and species. By the time you get to the top, those little twin twigs and the little buds at the end of the twigs, those are the species. The twigs and that's the genus. And as you go down, you can see the evolution of that biological evolution. Now, there are many different forms of evolution. They use that tree as a kind of a graphic organizer. It's true in the macrocosm. It's also true in the microcosm. Because a living person is like a tree. We begin with our soul, the seed, which is our soul, that is the living embodied soul. We put down the roots into the earth, that is our samskaras, the vasanas. The tree sprouts and grows. The trunk of the tree is the trunk of our body. The limbs of the tree are the limbs of our body. The sap flowing in the tree is the prana and the life force in our body. And as we grow, it's all about growth. Growing from the lower to the higher. And as we grow to the higher, the branches become more and more fine, become thinner and more dispersed. And the leaves appear everywhere. Flowers appear. And we have to look up to see the beauty of that tree. And you know that in ancient times, they used to worship trees because trees were a symbol of spiritual evolution and the unfoldment of the spirit soul and the growth of the spirit soul. And in fact, if you look at a great tree, you look up in the leaves, way up in the branches, you can't see any outline. There's no definite outline. That is, it is infinite. It suggests to our minds the infinite. And therefore, in a way, we perceive the infinite. And therefore, in ancient times, people used to consider that that was a portal for divine consciousness. That is the meditation on the tree of life. So we can see that we have the evolution tree, and then we have the tree with its roots above and the branches below. It appears to be like a contradiction. Which one is it? And the answer, of course, is in the tree itself, that as it grows upward and produces the flowers and the fruits and the seeds, and in the seeds fall to the ground. And thus the life cycle is completed. And so here we see the teaching of the Vedanta philosophy. Involution and evolution are two phases of a great cycle. We could call it in the macrocosm, we could call it the great cycle of birth and death, the great wheel of transmigration called samsara. In the microcosm, we see the same evolution, involution, and evolution. We need to understand involution before we can appreciate and understand the telos of evolution. Telos means that we have a purpose. We have, as human beings, we have a natural purpose. It's called our dharma. And that is What is our purpose? Well, our purpose is to return to our source. But we need to understand, we need to have both phases of the cycle in order to get the holistic impression of what's going on. We can't understand the evolution without knowing the backstory of the involution. It doesn't make any sense. We can't give meaning to it. The key word here in understanding our meaning, what is our meaning? The key word here is the word return. Return means the wheel is going, it's a wheel, go forward and downward, inward and upward. And like, well, we can say, for example, like salmon. Fish, where maybe you see some salmon in the sea. That's where they live. Most of their life they live in the sea. And then it seems that they go to a river. At the end of their life, they find the river, and they go up that river and they fight their way all the way up back to the headwaters of some little freshwater pond. And we think, how could we ever explain that? What a strange phenomena. Well, we can't explain it unless we understand the backstory. You have to understand, where did that salmon come from? He came from that very pond. And he left that pond, traveled all that way down the river. And now he is fighting his way to return. That's the story of, great old biblical parable of the prodigal son. You know, how he suffered in the world, and how in the end he returned to the Father. And we can't understand this whole story. We have to begin the story how there he was with the Father, how happy he was, and he thought that it became estranged, that he kind of fell from grace. He left his home. He traveled far away. And he suffered, and he resolved then to return to the Father. Makes sense. Similarly it is with ourselves. We too, in our spiritual life, why is it that we're struggling like a tree? Why is it that we're interested in personal growth? Why is it that we're interested in expanding our consciousness? Why is it that we're thinking in that spatial metaphor of upward, from below to the higher, from the lower to the higher? Why is that? That's because we're thinking in terms of return. But we can't understand it unless we know that, remember, the first phase of the cycle. A story has three parts: the beginning, the middle, and the end. Today, we're somewhere in the middle. We've fallen from grace, we've fallen from heaven, and we are struggling to return. Involution began with God. Evolution will end with God. And the goal and purpose of our life is to realize God and return to our source. Om Dyo Shanti Antariksha Ham Shanti Prithivi Shanti Apa Shanti Oshadaya Shanti Vanaspataya Shanti Vishwe Deva Shanti Brahma Shantihi Saravam Shantihi Shantireva Shantihi Sa Me Shantiredhi Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. Om. Peace is in heaven, peace is on the earth, peace is in the sky and in the waters. The herbs and plants and trees are full of peace. The gods are peaceful. May this eternal, universal peace enter our souls and beings. Om. Peace, peace, peace be unto us all.